As noble citizens, we must bypass a life of dormancy and vice to pursue the generative endeavor of a hard day's work. The benefits of these pursuits are not secured by chance or charity, but through the merit of your character and the firmness of your convictions. It is you who are planting the seeds of trees whose shade you know you shall never see.
We're in. Hello, dear listener. Welcome back to the Hell on the Beach podcast, the Broken Wind podcast's little side series about the beautiful sunny state of Florida. I'm your host, Butler. I got my friend and super producer here, my co-host, Vane. Say hello.
What's up?
We're here to walk you through a little bit more of the history and story of the state of Florida through the eyes of our friend T.D. Allman in his wonderful book, Finding Florida.
And this is now the premium section of the podcast.
Premium.
Premium.
This is premium content.
So until a later date, TBD, this may or may not be released to the public. You may only be getting this because you are subscribed, and in that case,
thank you very much. If you're listening. That's such a good point, and that's why you are a fucking fantastic producer, my friend. Thank you so much for subscribing. If you're subscribed, thank you for listening to the premium feed. We're trying to do something a little different here with this, and we appreciate your support so much. So, like I said, today we're talking more about T.D. Allman's Finding Florida. We're talking about it from chapters 3 and 4. I had a little personal anecdote I wanted to start the episode with.
Might be the same one, I'm thinking. But
well, no,
see.
Maybe. I mean, I'd love to hear yours, but this is something I haven't told you yet. So we talked a lot about feral hogs in the last episode. Right?
Sure did. We got some hog sounds in there.
Sure did. Talked a lot about feral hogs. And I hadn't actually I've seen them in other parts of the country. I had actually never seen them in Florida. But I was driving to work the other day, and I saw not just one feral hog, a family of feral hogs. And these were some of the largest hogs I think I've ever seen in my life. These were fucking monsters. So that was pretty cool. So yeah, I mean, it's real. The hogs are real here.
Hopefully they're subscribed now.
Yeah, we have that family of feral hogs is subscribed and listening to the show. Shouts out to them. Honestly, it's really cool how I really like. I feel like it's so interesting how fraught the relationship is with human beings and pigs, because they're such fucking survivors, and they're very smart, so they're probably very human when you get to know them in a lot of ways, but they're also just pigs. So I don't know. Not to digress. I also wanted to read the first couple sentences of chapter 3 actually, because chapter 3 and 4 will hammer home a lot of themes about Florida history that we've already been, sort of dissecting in chapter 1 and 2 in that, first episode. But there's the theme of Spanish Empire fail in Florida is just absolutely underscored heavily by these chapters, and it's just like can't be ignored enough that like the history of Spanish conquest in Florida, this is the prospect that kind of was like when you ask yourself like, how could this empire that was pulling gold out of every corner of the New World they could find not able to float financially? It kind of feels like Florida might be a big part of that equation sometimes when you think about it.
It's a big part of their sunk cost fallacy, essentially.
Well, literal sunk costs too. Like and so let me read these sentences from the chapter 3 of Finding Florida. I mean, so between 1513 and 1565, no fewer than 8 expeditions were sent to Florida with the aim of establishing Spanish rule there. Florida stymied every one of them. In 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón arrived with a flotilla of 6 ships carrying more than 600 people, including soldiers, settlers, their wives and children, doctors, and slaves from Africa. Here is an account of what happened to their settlement. During the fall, the colonists suffered from disease, lack of food, and cold. Scouting parties were sent inland to locate native populations from which food could be obtained, but they were not successful. Many people died, including Ayllón. Some members of the colony moved to a nearby Indian village, but after several days there, native hosts killed them. Raids took a toll on the Spaniards, and at one point some of the African slaves set fire to buildings. Defeated, the colonists abandoned the settlement in mid-November and set sail for home. So, yeah. And I think one of the things that stuck out to me reading that, too, that I thought about, it's like, it is a really important part of the story of Florida, too. The, like, black identity of Florida.
Yeah.
Is that there are those slaves who set fire to those buildings and could have escaped, It's like that's
right.
Something that will come up again and again is that the Seminole society, Florida society, throughout this period became this very interesting amalgamation of basically like the people who could survive in Florida and chose to.
Right.
And so some of those people were indigenous. Some of those people were kidnapped African slaves who had, found a way to survive there amongst and within the indigenous communities.
Yeah.
This sort of synthesis.
And this is one of the ongoing themes that we're going to find all throughout this chapter that we're already starting to see here in the opening lines of chapter 3. This is kind of just the opening salvo of what's to come. And we can see parts of the history that probably many of the listeners haven't heard before. And a lot of what we're going to talk about is a history that's been whitewashed or covered up in many ways. So you might not have heard about these riots that happened with freed slaves that burned down the cities, because this is part of what we don't want to talk about in our early history. And that includes early periods of riots. And as we move further into the series and talk about contemporary and emerging Confederate myths and things like that, there's these myths that the slaves themselves were happy. And here's clear material evidence to the contrary, and the history that they don't want to talk about.
Right. Well, the axis of enslaved African people and indigenous resistance, like those two demographics coordinating, is the nightmare of the federal government. As always has been, always will be, and especially at this time was like the thing they were more afraid of than anything else. So
yeah, we'll of course get into that much more later, but that's just a little hint at what's to come.
And moving forward in the text too, he covers like 1, 2, 3, at least 3 more failed trips to Florida by Spaniards. And again, like,
I want to cover those each too.
Yeah, I always want to make sure you got to let me cover I want to do Tristan de Luna. But my thing too is like, I always want to make sure to point out, and T.D. Allman does as well, that like this really was also a time of literal like biological holocaust for indigenous people too, because of the diseases being brought by these people. This being such an early point of human contact with North America, like with indigenous societies in this part of the world and European societies, that it is like one of the early places for that vector of contamination that ravaged North America too. People think think that went on to do major damage further north in the world.
Yeah, another
like as far as Massachusetts.
Yeah, another theme that's going to keep coming up is the law of unintended consequences in Florida. And that ultimately starts out with the Spanish having ambitions to capture people and enslave them in the New World and to use them as labor. But then, due to the law of unintended consequences, they start dying in, as you said, this massive, basically, Holocaust that happens.
Right.
And there are many books on this. One I can think of that's very good by Jared Diamond is Guns, Germs, and Steel. We're not going to go too much into this, but there's an argument that's articulated in that is basically yet another argument of the law of unintended consequences and our failure to understand the real reason why this land suddenly seemed to open up to us.
Yes.
And it's because of as Jared Diamond argues, it's because of our immune systems, which were developed through our concentrated populations in Europe. And having just encountered the Black Death, we brought all kinds of diseases, which we'll talk about, that are listed early in this chapter.
Why don't you cover the first two guys? I want to cover Tristan de Luna's
here, I'll talk about this is a great quote about the law of unintended consequences early in chapter 3. He says, The ruination of the Spaniards inflicted on themselves was trivial in comparison to the horror they unleashed on Florida's original people. Smallpox, malaria, typhus, bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, measles, and yellow fever all arrived with the Europeans. As European diseases swept the Americas, the human population of all the islands from Cuba down to South America perished. So did the populations of Newfoundland and the Bahamas. In Florida, too, the insular quality of life had protected its people for millennia. But when the invasion finally came, they were even less prepared to survive contagion than the continental populations were. As the native peoples died, so did the conquistadors' dream of conquest. The two catastrophes engendered each other. The Spanish carried diseases that killed them. By dying, the indigenous people denied the Spanish the labor essential to their system of empire.
Yeah, it goes back to something we talked about before. It's about like how Florida's a small place, and it's kind of been the same place this whole time. And I want to go back a little bit because I wanted to read this one fail. We don't have to read all of them, but one fail voyage of one of these guys that I thought was really funny was Tristan de Luna. In 1559, set out from Mexico pursuing the novel strategy of trying to conquer Florida from the north rather than the south. He and his expedition landed in the vicinity of present-day Pensacola just in time for a hurricane to destroy their provisions, supplies, and hopes. Tristan de Luna was successful by one measure. He was the first leader of a Spanish expedition to escape with his life. Loser. And then after that segment you just read, T.D. Allman writes that in 1566, they established the first, 100 Florida missions. 1566 is 200 years before the California was, really, colonized by the Spanish Catholic crown. It's that is crazy. And it is one of those things about Florida that I think is very notable too, that that influence, once it was finally established, has been more consistent than the federal government in Florida, than the United States federal government. That's been there longer as just the Catholic Church, for all its negatives and positives. So
right,
mostly positives, we'll say. Or I'd say mostly negatives.
Yeah, then another fail that he mentions, he says in 1528, Panfilo de Narvaez drowned in the course of his attempt to conquer Florida. Only 4 of the 1,500 men who started out with him survived. The most famous survivors, Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, found rescue only after he had walked from Florida clear across Texas. In 1548, Father Luis Cancer de Barbarossa was clubbed to death on a Florida beach. And then is the story about Arellano that you just told.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's 1566. The Spanish have established themselves colonially with the Catholic Church, but it's still not going well. You know what I mean? It's still costing a fucking shitload of money, and they're not finding gold. That's not what's here. So
right.
They found a misshapen spinal column of a youth maybe 15 years old that had been thousands of years old in Cape Canaveral in 1982.
Yeah, it had spina bifida.
Yeah.
Spina bifida.
The Catholic Church has been here a long time, but I also think one of the things being emphasized here too is this has just been a place where people have been struggling to overtake each other and have control of this place for a very long time.
Yeah, so that section that you're talking about, it starts to transition to the archaeology here of Florida.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're going to take a little tangent now into the early archaeology of Florida, away from the conquistadors, and then we end up transitioning back, because a major theme in this book is how every day, and we talked about this in our episode on archaeology too a few weeks back, we talked about how every day the materials that humans are leaving behind are modern day artifacts of archaeology.
Right.
That if a human or some other intelligent life were to expect, it's going to leave a story, regardless of whether you want to hide that. And that's a recurring theme here in Florida, is trying to hide the original peoples and trying to hide the early sins of the European conquistadors and to try to tell the story as if it begins with what is essentially a mythical figure in Ponce de Leon. And that's something that we should talk about too, is our disagreement we had last episode on the pronunciation of Ponce, which I think is a great example of another major theme in this book.
I was owned. I'll just say it. I was owned. I was wrong. And
well, maybe not.
Was right. And well,
it's a great example of what's in a name and questioning that, and how in Florida, names don't mean a thing, and that's really a theme.
Or borders too, for that matter.
Yeah, borders. We're going to talk about that. How borders hardly matter in Florida.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say that, like, I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the archaeological side of this too, because I really think that we can talk all day about Spanish people wasting their money in Florida on this or that silly thing. But I think you really have to understand Florida as a place and the archaeology of it a little bit to really get why it is such a confounding place. Like, you're just talking about the way in which there's all this, like, hiding and erasing in this place that literally has zero mountains or valleys or any, it's like there is nowhere to hide in a place like Florida.
So the two of us had some confusion over the pronunciation of Ponce or Ponce. And I believe there's confusion over this to this day, and it shows that in Florida, names don't mean a thing, and that's the general theory of the book based on Richard Feynman and a story about Feynman, ultimately with the conclusion that if you know a name, it doesn't necessarily mean you understand something. And that's the way of thinking critically that is articulated in Feynman's book, The Pleasure of Knowing Things, I believe.
Yeah,
and we had a disagreement on the pronunciation of Ponce or Ponce, and I believe Ponce is probably what you hear more from the people today in Florida, and what you might hear I bet it's what you'd hear at a museum, because it's the more anglicized version of it.
100%.
But I had been listening to an audiobook of this and hearing it pronounced, maybe cultured. I had always thought that it was Ponce because of either its Italian or Spanish
That's
roots.
What I was going to say is that, like, in retrospect, it's obvious because if you think of it in an Italian way, it's definitely Ponce. It's like they would pronounce the E. So,
but if you're living in Florida or grew up in Florida, it probably sounded pretty funny to hear me keep saying Ponce over and over.
Dude, it was,
and it just goes to show that in Florida, if you think you know a name, you don't know a thing, really. And
you fucking don't.
We both got owned. Like, I felt like I was owned last episode, and now maybe you got owned by only learning the Anglican pronunciation.
I'm sorry for making you feel owned for even 1 second. And like I said, to get back to the archaeology for a second, we're going to get back to the chapter, but we'll also detour about borders a little bit, because we were talking about this before we started recording, that the actual, like, first off, even the name of Florida we hadn't even talked about, but, like, that's its own confabulation. That is, there is a lot of flowers in Florida. Flowers do love Florida, but the borders of the region of Florida have changed quite a bit over time. It actually used to be quite a bit larger, cover a lot of Louisiana, and a lot of just, like, the inner Gulf region.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about, like, in the Louisiana Purchase, how presidents will at times include Florida within Louisiana if it's convenient for them, or they'll conveniently say, oh, that doesn't include Florida. And it's just a total matter of convenience what counts as Florida at the earliest time period.
And that's why I also mentioned the Great Raft too last time, that, like, large archaeological lost, like, feature of the Americas that at this time would have been like, certainly noticeable defining feature of this whole region, all the way down to, like, Tallahassee in that area. So and probably below.
Yeah, so if we pivot back to archaeology, if we start inspecting the archaeological record early on in Florida, as you said, in 1982, there's discovered a case of a person with spina bifida. It says the badly crippled youth could never have walked. Brown points out who was the person who found this. Robin C. Brown, who wrote Florida's First People. She said, "The badly crippled youth could never have walked, yet they cared for him. Archaeologists also found the remains of a murder victim. He had been trying to escape when attackers speared him." So It goes to show, as is argued in The Dawn of Everything, that if you're trying to make an argument about human nature, looking at the archaeological record, looking at anywhere early on, you can find evidence proving one way or the other that either human nature is pure good or pure bad. And the example of the person who had been getting fed with crippling spinal defect, birth defect, is an example of how social humans were and how they took care of one another early on. And it's an argument that human natures have always been caring and selfless. And yet, you can look at evidence in the same place that shows evidence of what today we would call a crime scene. It's a murder scene. And archaeologists are aware that this person must have been killed for some kind of self-interested reason at the end of the day. And capitalists have argued that projecting this backwards, that humans have always been self-interested and everything is really about rational self-interest, including presumably killing a person. And now we have evidence of his remains. Mm-hmm. Here's a good quote talking about the early people in Florida. It says, "The initial peopling of Florida was a migrational rivulet eddying off a much broader peopling of the Americas. New findings keep pushing back the date of mankind's first apparition in the Western Hemisphere, but in terms of evolution, it occurred so recently that no Neanderthals or Homo erectus ever roamed the Western Hemisphere. We are the only species of the genus Homo ever to reach the Americas. Like the Sunbelt migrants of today, these first peoples changed Florida irrevocably and forever by being there. Within 1,500 years, all of Florida's large beasts, including supersized camels and giant 500-pound beavers, were extinct. The horse also disappeared, though it would return with the Spanish."
When I first read that, I read, within 1,500 years, all of Florida's large breasts, including supersized. I had to read it like 4 times because I was like, no! But I was like, that
large
also
breasts.
can't be right.
You just kept seeing large breasts.
Turns out it was the large beast. But I think I'm reading that right, too. That's like, horses were here, and then they went extinct, and then they came back.
With the Spanish. Yeah, then the Spanish brought them.
Crazy. Yeah, and I've been to that museum. Like, it is really quite astounding. The kind of stuff that you people can say beyond a shadow of a doubt lived in the state of Florida, a place that, once again...
Yeah, the Museum of Natural History in Gainesville, it says you can see the skeleton of a mammoth that lived in Florida some 16,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things, like I said, where it's like people think of Florida as like this sandbar that's just like an apparition and fading into the ocean. And then you see these things that establish it's like, no, this place has been here for quite a long time and probably always will be in some sense.
Yeah.
Or at least like, some form of it, some amount. So it's just amazing to see.
Yeah, until people arrived in the first Great Migration, which was before the Europeans. And that's what that section above meant when it said, we are the only species of the genus Homo ever to reach the Americas. We now know from the archaeological record that Homo erectus and Neanderthals never reached the Western Hemisphere. So there was one great migration that happened, and we know now that this happened across the Bering land mass, which was a little bit more connected, but not so much that it was a bridge, because on this time scale, we don't have large enough tectonic shifts. This was human ingenuity. Humans built canoes with outriggers and began hopping islands. And we know this, as we talked about in the archaeology episode, we learn about cultural horizons, and one of them is the Lapida horizon, which are the Pacific Islander peoples who have tattooed themselves for who knows how long and have hopped between different islands, and it's why at some point every island had already been conquered. There was already one great migration of humans across the Bering landmass, and they populated the entire Western Hemisphere before we discovered it going the other way across the Atlantic Ocean when the Europeans discovered it and presumed that it was being first discovered. And what this shows is we now know that in that first great migration, humans also were an invasive species that dramatically changed the flora and fauna that were there. In technical terms, the fauna were megafauna. There were 500-pound beavers. There were massive creatures. Most of Florida was underwater, so there were gators. There weren't livestock
there were some
yet.
Big
like
motherfucking gators, though, man. Like, can I read a section?
Megatrucks.
I want to read a section. Like, this is something. If you ever go to a museum in Florida, you will see, and like, it's hard to think it's not like fake, but they have the real skeletons, and like, T.D. Allman, great writer, shouts out. I want to read this section because he's talking about woolly mammoths, which once again you had in Florida. Crazy to think about, but he writes this great section about humans hunting them. I want to read here. He says, "This magnificent creature was more than 15 feet tall when it raised its mighty head, displayed its immense tusks, and bellowed. Until people got there, bigger had been better in Florida. The invention of the spear point changed that. Use of spears meant that small groups of emotionally bonded, task-driven armed humans, the forerunners of the military platoon and many other forms of teamwork, could battle, kill, then feed themselves, their mates, and their offspring on the flesh of beasts that otherwise would have been invulnerable."
Right.
And that is, I think, a great description of what is going on in Florida for a very long time. Like, prehistory was very happening in Florida, and that's like an interesting thing to see a record of. And that's why, like, the indigenous genocide of Florida does have this particular sort of like melancholy to it, because you got to think like this is so much human history that's just lost to time now, but that like was always so fragile by the nature of this place. So
right. And to continue along the text, it says, "The inventions of the Paleolithic and Neolithic eras revolutionized the world's hierarchy of speciation, turning humans into the planet's dominant species. But how to have a Stone Age without stones? In addition to having no metals, Florida has no jasper or obsidian. Those substances are the products of volcanic eruptions, and Florida has no igneous rocks of any kind. Hence also no coal or diamonds or opals or any other stones in the usual sense of the word. In Florida, people mastered Stone Age technology, though they had no stone. From the fossilized remains of dead sponges, they manufactured dagger-like weapons efficient enough to render extinct whole species of megafauna. The most important tool-making material they used is called Chert, which is the title of this chapter.
I was about to say, I can't believe we haven't even introduced Chert yet. We're a half hour in. We got to talk Chert.
Chert, in its finished form, is characterized by its extreme hardness, glass-like fracture, and the sharpness of the edges, notes one geologist. That made it ideal for the manufacturing of axe heads, spearheads, and arrow points, but Chert doesn't occur in nature that way. Before it could be knapped into tools and weapons, Chert first had to be extracted from the thick layers of limestone encasing it, then broken down into manageable nuggets. Chunks of the material weighing as much as 75 pounds were then buried in sand, over which hot fires were made to burn for many hours. Once extracted from these Paleolithic furnaces, the nuggets were broken into smaller pieces. They in turn were laboriously transformed into a dusty gray substance, gritty to the touch, into a smooth, shiny substance with a palette of attractive hues ranging from pastel pink to mahogany brown. These, depending on their structure and the inventiveness of the people working them, were fashioned into a variety of ornaments, tools, and weapons. This elaborate tampering process was a triumph in human inventiveness and organization, but Chert was rare and hard to find, so, even more remarkably, people in South Florida developed methods of transforming agitized coral into killing blades. Such implements prove that what is true in the age of nuclear weapons was also true more than 15,000 years ago. Man's intelligence, not the weapons he used, was what made him such an efficient killer. Bigger and heavier than the much more famous Clovis spear points, the Chert spear points made in Florida worked so well they made themselves obsolete. As the big beasts these spear points killed disappeared, the weapons, like the animals they were used to kill, became smaller and smaller. Right from the start, people transformed Florida. As the evolution of their weapons technology reveals, Florida transformed them back, from big game hunters into baymen, fishermen, trappers, and scavengers.
Yeah, I'm trying to resist just reading the book. But
yeah, right.
It is, like I said, very well written, really worth reading. And the next section gets into how, even though a lot of America's most famous crops, like chilies and tomatoes and potatoes, were mainstays of regions that were very close by, they weren't brought to to Florida for a very long time, and only after they had been brought to Europe and cultivated there too.
Right.
And ultimately, it gets back to something we were talking about early on, about how, like, Florida, just in this fascinating way, just like naturally resists accumulation.
Right.
In this way that has like gone on through time.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Again, trying to resist reading the whole text, but I want to read this thing T.D. Rollman wrote at the end of this paragraph because it's very good. The underlying limitation of the land helps explain why, for so long, agriculture scarcely existed. The lack of food reserves to loot enraged the Spaniards nearly as much as the lack of gold mines did. They had stormed into the midst of a society that, in spite of its surface abundance, was far less productive and resilient than it seemed.
Right.
And I think that right there is is a fantastic sentence about Florida overall, even to this day.
Yeah.
It's like this place that has this incredible surface abundance, and yet it is actually a lot more like tenuous and fragile than it kind of seems.
Right. And that actually speaks to it makes you understand why the early conquistadors ultimately had that sense of white man's burden, that to them it felt irrational that when they got to Florida, the native people would not have accumulated surplus for them to then steal. And it was also very irritating to them that it says that they actually were pretty robust people and that they lived in a prodigal way, which reminds me a lot of Stone Age Economics by Marshall Solins, which talks about this a lot too, and how there's a rationality actually that ends up emerging in places like Florida, where we can actually go back and understand now as archaeologists and economists that there was a clear rationality to why people would not accumulate large amounts of surplus in places like Florida. And although it didn't seem rational to the early conquistadors, there actually is a clear explanation that shows these people were thinking. And that's another part that this reminds me about from The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. The Graves. They talk about how the portrayal of Western civilization as being the best, they often portray history as beginning with this agricultural revolution. And clearly, this text also shows that it wasn't a revolution at all, that even though it was quite rational and obvious that you could plant things in other places, the native peoples did not plant things in Florida, and they didn't have permanent agriculture. They'd prefer to do things like flood retreat farming, which has its own rationality of understanding that the coasts are going to constantly shift, and there's no possible way that people are going to like a permanent social structure based on land permanence when they know the land itself is not permanent. And so all of this is very clear that the native peoples actually had a rationality that was not understood by the early European conquistadors. And you can see their anger and aggrievement at the fact that by the time they had arrived there, they had not accumulated surplus. But as the archaeological record shows, in the ebbs and flows of time, there's advancement. You get larger tools when you need to kill larger creatures, and then the tools get smaller. And so by the time the Europeans had shown up...
And they focus more on fishing and getting their food from the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. The book says that people had evolved into fishermen and things like that. So by the time the Europeans arrived, they think that they're quote-unquote backwards, but it's really a natural way that they had evolved to adapt to Florida.
Well, and I wanted to make a point, too, that, like, I just keep thinking about that guy who showed up at Pensacola and immediately got blown away by a hurricane, which, as we read, was only, like, less than a decade before they would finally establish a Spanish mission there. But it's like that guy, like... You got to travel light, like, and that's something that the locals and natives already knew. That, like,
and there's
in
a major
the event of that,
exactly.
If you have a lot of shit with you, got a big old ship.
That's a major recurring theme here throughout the whole book. Honestly, that there is an irrationality of the colonial mindset in thinking that things in Florida are going to remain permanent. That when you buy a plot of land, you expect it's always going to be there forever. Sometimes nature has other plans. You don't expect a hurricane to come and wipe it out. And just as we do as tourists, I remember the last time I was in Florida, I couldn't help but feel this mindset. And that's a recurring theme throughout this book, is that the mindset of the conquistador says that everything that happens to them, which is really to be expected, is somehow unexpected. And that's how the news will portray it. This story of the frogs in the early 90s that emerged in Florida and really made people think of what a wacky place Florida is. But it's just an example of Florida revealing to us its plans are different from those of the conquistadors. And the best that we can do in the news is sort of laugh about it and act surprised when these events pop up. And we act like it's unexpected that something happened, like the reaction we'll talk about later with the Seminole people fighting back in Dade County. They call it the Dade County Massacre, and the Americans are shocked to find out that the indigenous peoples would fight back. And it goes to show that there's a continuing thread to this day of us being shocked whenever we arrive in Florida, shocked that Florida would have the audacity to rain on our parade. When we got to Florida, we expected that it wasn't going to rain, but everybody knew that it was going to rain in the afternoon in Florida. Everybody knew the storms were coming in September, and we're constantly surprised to find that the best laid plans are destroyed in Florida.
Some indigenous person at some point in time built some big giant boat just to try it out, and then a hurricane f***ed it up, and everyone saw it. They were like, "Well, I guess we're not doing that." And it's like the Spanish needed a big giant boat to even get to Florida, and they tried several times and failed anyway. And I think that's something T.D. Allman makes a point of too, is that, like, there is a degree to which it's like Florida was really benefiting from a kind of relative isolation too, that allowed for this place of actual incredible natural abundance where people seem to live entire lives of just, like, fishing and eating shellfish on the fucking beach, and it seems pretty cool. So good for them.
And actually being pretty relaxed and well fed, which is, again, to bring up Solin's book, Stone Age Economics, that is the actual natural, quote unquote, economy is that people consume whatever food they have. They rest for a few days here. They work for a few days there, rest again. And there is no real structured 9 to 5 in nature.
And on the subject, he brings up the indigenous Holocaust again via disease. And I mean, like just the indigenous death and genocide that was caused by that. But he writes very eloquently here. I want to read. He says, "The first of Florida's modern human tragedies, their extinction, was but one of many episodes in a biological melodrama of genetic advance and retreat that had been unfolding there since time immemorial and continues to unfold all around us. All sorts of animals, plants, and microbes are constantly making bizarre apparitions in Florida because in addition to the ambiguity of land and water, there's an ambiguity of air and temperature. Is it tropic or temperate? Hot or cold? Northern or southern? You may think you know the answer until the jet stream plunges south and bringing freezing winds and killer frost with it. According to the National Weather Service, 2 of the 10 most destructive natural disasters to strike Florida in the course of the 20th century were fits of cold weather. Even in average years, winter chills are a fact of life, yet people are seemingly perennial unnerved when the cold front arrives. I am greatly in need of a coat, Miss Clara Leonard, a Miami widow, wrote when chilly weather hit in December 1934. If you have one which you have laid aside from last season, I would appreciate it so much if you would send it to me." And this is actually, I will say too, this is one of those things I was excited to sort of talk about with this book, in that we're now 10 years on from when he published it. And it's not as cold in Florida, unfortunately. I talked about, he's right, that it is always colder than you expect, and this could very well change because of the geographic position of Florida does make it very, it can be anything at any time in some strange senses, like he's talking about, but it has not been nearly as cold, and you do still experience a notable climate shift simply because of how long Florida is.
Yeah, and he says the denial of frost is one of the great recurring themes that we'll end up going back to over and over again throughout this series. And he says that people don't deny, though, of course, hurricanes. And one of the earliest examples of a hurricane happening, he says here in a quote, "Yet Florida's hurricanes, with one exception, have killed hundreds rather than thousands of people. This is because until recently, Florida had so few, and most of them did not live in the lowest lying areas of peninsular Florida as they do today. The 1928 Lake Okeechobee hurricane led to the deaths, chiefly by drowning, of nearly 3,000 people. They were killed when the hurricane winds caused the waters of Okeechobee, which is 3/4 the size of the state of Rhode Island, to slosh violently over the dikes. Zora Neale Hurston described Florida better than anyone else ever has, and maybe ever will. That goes for her description of people fleeing for their lives ahead of Lake Okeechobee flood. The monstropolis beast had left its bed. The 200 miles an hour wind had loosened its chains. He seized hold of his dikes and ran forward until he met the quarters, uprooted them like grass, and rushed on after his supposed-to-be conquerors, rolling the dikes, rolling the houses, rolling the people in the houses, along with other timbers. The sea was walking the earth with a heavy heel. "The lake is coming," TK gasped. "The lake," in amazed horror for the motorboat. "The lake, it's coming behind us," Janie shuddered. The mother of malice had trifled with men, Hurston wrote. Actually, it was the other way around. Had those man-made dikes not existed, there would have been no fatal rush of water. Lake Okeechobee would have spread gradually and benignly out over the Everglades, providing a new injection of fresh water and vegetal nutrients rather than surging out in a homicidal rampage. The human response, as always in Florida, was to distort the contours of the land even more drastically. Today the dikes are so high, you cannot see Lake Okeechobee as you drive past it. Encasing Okeechobee was only the start. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers also constructed what is known as the East Coast Protective Levee. Zigging and zagging 100 miles from Homestead, south of Miami, up through Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, The immense project artificially separated the Everglades from its natural drainage outlets, transforming an immense swath of wetlands into momentarily dry land. It amounted to a government-financed subsidy of urban sprawl and real estate speculation in South Florida. It also consisted of a disruption of nature, which nature, sooner or later, will find a way to correct. The difference being that, this time, millions, not thousands of people will be endangered. So that shows the evolving scale of problems, as he shows that Lake Okeechobee is really the first hurricane that kills thousands instead of maybe hundreds of people. And now, due to the scale of urban sprawl, which we will talk about, this story of real estate developers and the story of how millions of people only in the 20th century come to inhabit Florida, that the scale now of such disasters, which we still imagine to be unexpected, are really something very much to be expected, and that it's not a surprise at all when storms hit these regions that have hit these regions forever at the same time of year. And the only real change is that more and more humans have chosen to settle in these places, almost assuming that nature wouldn't continue to do what it's always done, which is preposterously irrational, even though the conquistadors imagine that when they moved to Florida with the plans of permanently settling, they're, of course, the rational ones, and the ones who have lived lightly and without much surplus must be irrational, and they're angry at them for it.
What I was going to say is that something that's changed since this book came out, too, that's interesting, is that there are, I could send you videos of this later, just, we can talk about it in the next episode. There are not insignificant sections of Central Florida near, major Florida universities that, since Hurricane Ian, which was a pretty significant hurricane to hit Central Florida in particular, and I mean, people imagine there's parts of Florida that are safer than other parts of Florida from hurricanes. They're kind of right, but then what happened to this particular place is, because it's so central, it did not drain off nearly as well as people would like, and there are, massive complexes of abandoned communities, again, built for students near a major university, and it's, enrollment being down is a part of all this. It's there's not enough demand for anyone to be fixing these places up, but it's still staggering to see, these modern ghost towns right in the middle of, very populated Orlando, Florida. But
yeah, that
it's just
does
the
sound
story of this place.
Right, it's crazy.
It's always how it happens. It's very, very crazy to see. So
yeah, and it's the ebbs and flows that he talks about. And there's another great descriptive passage here where he talks about the melodrama of heat exchange, basically. And you can imagine that also with the populations. And we'll talk about that as different populations start to settle in Florida, especially really in the 20th century. You start to have, actually not even really only in the 20th century, the whole time you have, as we'll talk about, these different groups pulled in, first the Spanish and then the French and the English. They're all trying to get a piece of Florida, essentially, and assuming that there's something there that's been piled up, some big surplus that's stacked up there.
Right, because all these people look so happy and they're doing so well. They have so much food. They must be buying that from someone. It's so strange.
Yeah, so it says this nice passage here about the ebbs and flows. This is page 26. He says, whether it's the behavior of air or water, animals or plants, microbes or humans, explaining and propelling all that happens in Florida is the melodrama of heat exchange. Just like in chemistry class, heat expands on a global scale as air and water try to reach planetary equilibrium. The rotation and inclination of the Earth as it circles the sun make that impossible, but nature keeps trying, so every year tropical storms carry immense quantities of warm water and moisture northward. Beneath the ocean surface, immense volumes of warmer water are also flowing north. We call the northern coursing warm waters that flow past Florida the Gulf Stream. the most powerful of the northward moving air masses we call hurricanes. Different as they seem, the underlying symmetry of ocean currents and hurricanes is an elegant manifestation of how gases, such as heated tropical air, and liquids, such as heated ocean water, work out the same rules of nature in their own ways.
Right, and it is fascinating how much of this stuff is coming off of the coast of Africa too, these storms, and that's always been the case. And then, not to date the episode, but at this very moment I believe there is a hurricane marching into the lower Caribbean. And if the listener looks at a map, there's sort of like two routes through which a hurricane can get into the Gulf. And a hurricane in the Gulf is major devastation time, just because it hits regions that don't get hit that often and tend to be very flood prone because they're in Florida. And there were quite a few of these storms last year too, and inshallah we're not going to have another one soon, but not to date the episode, but it's Gabrielle. So yeah, like, just again, the geology of Florida cannot be understated. And I don't know if he gets into it much here too, but like, there is a real record of early Floridians clearly trading for other materials outside of Florida from the rest of the country that they could not acquire from the geology of Florida, because it just is limited. Like, it's great for some things, but not for other things. So
yeah, right.
Yeah, and again, shouts out to T.D. Allman. That is a very a great quote there about the nature of heat exchange in Florida. It's something you very much see as a part of your day-to-day life. Seriously. Like, it's not an exaggeration at all.
Right.
The fact that we get a storm around the same time every single day during parts of the summer is a fact of heat exchange in the environment. And it's not
unexpected at all. And for us to portray in the news that it's unexpected every hurricane season that hurricanes come is part of the conquistador mindset that still remains to this day and still reveals itself in the way that we tell our news. And he talks about the melodrama of heat exchange, and he goes on to make comparisons to the people migrating from the north and from the south, and animals and birds, as we've talked about, that migrate to and from Florida in the seasonal exchange. And this is all part of the same patterns that play out of heat exchange. They play out with humans, and they play out with other creatures in their migratory patterns as well. So, yeah, there's the story of the tree frogs, which was a great example of the way that the news portrays these stories of nature in Florida as if they're wacky events. But the reality is that these things are actually predictable. And Florida becomes kind of a place of imagination. He talks about movies that go on to take these stories from Florida that are almost plague-like events, frogs crawling up from the ground. And movies are made in Hollywood, essentially, that were inspired by this, but now the frogs are raining from the sky instead. But it's still sort of the same idea.
Holy shit. Oh my god, I fucking completely forgot about this little factoid too. Yeah, dear listener, shouts out to my father. He exposed me to. Have you ever seen the frogs, bro?
I did when I was on vacation. I saw these little frogs all over the place.
No, the movie The Frogs.
Oh no, I never saw the movie The Frogs.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
1972 low budget horror
funny.
Flick.
Because the idea is that they're using these like macro shots of frogs and other animals as like the like horror jump scare, which just doesn't land.
It so jump you just cuts are like to just close ups of
jump
frogs.
cuts of like frogs close up and humans being like, it's really funny. So
that's awesome.
That's a fun afternoon if you're.
If
you're interested, listener.
There's another movie, Magnolia, apparently, by director Paul Thomas Anderson from 1999, that also uses that event it seems to use that event as its inspiration. And that story of the frogs, if I can find it.
He's telling the story of a specific plague
we don't
of
really
frogs
need to.
here.
I mean, I've given you the general overview.
No, I found
story.
it. I found it
Oh,
here.
you did?
What
Cool.
you're
You
talking
read
about?
that one?
Yeah, because basically he's talking about. I'll read from TD here again, trying not to read the whole book, listener, but it's really good. I mean, you gotta give it a try. The real life plague was infested with symbolism. For starters, Fort Walton Beach, in names as well as event, recapitulates Florida's whole transformation from U.S. military outpost to Sybaritic American seashore. It therefore is fully appropriate that the frogs in question should choose location to smite the notion that in Florida, the American dream, having crushed all resistance, had rolled on to total victory. The attack was even more precisely targeted than that. Before Dee Thompson, the woman who found the frogs, was executive director of the Panhandle Animal Welfare Society, modern Florida had been founded on the notion that nature could be trained to be cute like a family pet. Now, by the hundreds of thousands, these slimy, gooey, unpleasant frogs are expectorating, defecating, and fornicating all over the carefully kept files on cute little missing dogs and adoptable cats. I guess a good way to sum this whole section up would be that, like, the kinds of, like, natural, like, shoulder-to-shoulder, like, animal interactions you encounter as a Floridian are pretty non-trivial and a part of like everyday life for anyone living in Florida. I mean, I think one of those things that's just not exactly the same but sort of similar is just the way in which you have lizards everywhere you go in Florida. Everywhere you look, everywhere you see, there's lizards running around everywhere.
Oh yeah, I have seen those.
You can't avoid them. Yeah, that's something you can't. That's just a hallmark of being in Florida. And those little lizards have actually been studied ad nauseum because of their evolutionary like track that you can observe and the way in which they adapt to different climates in different ways and different like specific sections of the Caribbean. So, I mean, like that just speaks to everything we're talking about. You know, it's a dynamic place for evolution, and you get some crazy stuff happening, like frogs fucking falling from the sky.
Yeah, and here's a funny quote on that. It says, although it seemed on the surface, the Fort Walton Beach infestation resonated with great themes going deep into Florida's unique geography and climate. Illuminatingly, however, Floridians reacted to the events at Fort Walton Beach the same way people in the rest of America habitually react to events in Florida. Weird. But what do you expect in a place like that? Then they returned to their usual life pursuits, momentarily diverted, but in no way enlightened. And then another quote shortly after that, which talks about how Florida's ability to host new invasive species ultimately leads to one of its main characteristics being that everything that we think of as being uniquely Floridian actually came from somewhere else. So it says, in consequence, most of what seems typically Floridian originated someplace else, often brought by some military, political, economic, or cultural invader. Nothing seems more quintessentially Floridian than orange juice, unless it is the beautiful hibiscus blossom. Both originated in China, and then got to Florida via Europe. The music you hear in a Florida disco probably started out in the Caribbean, whilst the music you hear in a roadside bar is likely to have originated in the Appalachians. In Florida, North constantly meets South. South constantly meets North, as the two jostle their way up and down Florida into each other's territory. Florida is not merely where South meets North and vice versa. It's where they collide, clash, combat, and, more often than you'd suppose, caress and commingle. Ooh, TD Allman, you dog.
Oh, he's a dog.
Romantic
But he
boy.
goes on and on later about how Florida is very much the product of the waste of creatures living on it too. That's the story with coral. He talks a lot about bryozoan too.
Yeah, the bryozoans, which he says are so productive because they're a sexless creature.
Yeah, so he takes a no sex stance there too, which, you know, either way.
Yeah, and if you're living a no sex life, you can always just say it's because you're like a bryozoan. You're just trying to be productive.
Creating
You're
the state of
incredibly
Florida
productive.
with my wastes. Yeah,
And you're trading away sex for productivity.
There's also, I don't think he mentions it here too, but like mangroves and mangrove crabs became a very important species for like every little creature, as he said, that like produces some kind of shell or something that breaks up is an important part of what makes Florida possible, and are doing more to make Florida a livable, nice place than most of the human beings here. So it's It's a crazy place like that. I'm trying to get through this chapter. I feel like, is there anything else we should really cover with Chert? I think we're almost through it.
I think we're almost through this chapter, too. There was, it talks about, I believe, a tree that was imported from Australia. Yeah, the kudzu vine, which is a lot like some of the later Florida pests that we'll talk about. Some of the conquistadors who end up moving in and growing like ginormous weeds and sucking up all the rest of the wildlife. And this Australian pine, as it's called, is not really a pine. It actually is just a giant weed and is now one of the... It was imported because it looked like Mediterranean pines. They were valued for their Mediterranean look, but ultimately are now one of the biggest threats to the natural environment in Florida because these plants were imported there. And in a way, that's very symbolic of some of the people who will move there, like Henry Flagler and Walt Disney, who will suck up all the state resources and give none of them to the population.
You know what? And you're doing a great job of closing out the chapter, because T.D. Allman gets back to that subject, too, of, like, at the end of the way in which, like, ultimately there is this, like, rich, fascinating, and essentially lost, in many very critical senses, history of the Florida before the conquistadors and before European arrival. And that, unfortunately, is partially, like he said, just the nature of Florida's ever-changing and chaotic state, but it's also a very deliberate process of erasure and trying to tell a story of a place that, like we talked about with the parallels to Israel, too, that never end when you look at this stuff, that they wanted to tell the story of a land without people for a people without land, right? That's the story they wanted to tell, so they twisted the history however they could to tell that story when it was convenient for them.
Yeah, as if the people there didn't have their own history to begin with that was rich and interesting.
And the lost history for all of us as human beings now is just something we can only like speculate at on some level. But T.D. Allman does a good job of, I think, talking about all that really thoroughly, and we've tried to as well, dear listener, with chapter 3 here. So
yeah, I have a good quote of that as we close out this chapter.
I was looking for a good quote to close the chapter on.
Yeah, the Florida into which those first Europeans heedlessly blundered is a lost world now. Nothing can revive it, but we owe it, in simple decency, to those who perished, not to let perish the memory of what befell them. We also need to remember, for our own sake, Florida shows how, in every era, people are killed and cultures mutilated, and the earth ravaged because powerful men from far away, for vain and abstract reasons, on the basis of faulty information and without sufficient attention to the consequences of following their impulses, authorize barbarities that benefit no one, including, in the end, themselves. As the subsequent history of Florida would demonstrate again and again, these early events taught lessons we ignore to our own great peril. Yet, traditionally, Florida's historians have known nothing and cared less about what happened there before white men arrived. The Spanish archives all along rebutted any notion that Florida was almost devoid of human population. They repeatedly describe a well-populated land, though with each successive intrusion, the people became fewer. Archaeological research also refutes the notion that Florida's early peoples were artless, as well as very few in number. In 1896, at Marco Island site, now covered by a housing development, archaeologists unearthed works of art as impressive as the tools found there were ingenious. Yet, historians went on purveying the notion that Florida before the Europeans arrived had been virtually devoid of life, and even emptier of accomplishment. According to J.E. Double's 2-volume History of Florida, first published in 1950, the population of Florida just before the first white men got there was, quote, around 15,000, an impossibly low estimate. Things had not changed much by 1971, though that year Professor Charlton Tebu, in his History of Florida, did almost double the original population with the click of a typewriter key to about 25,000. Today, the advocates of political correctness and multiculturalism increasingly hold sway. In consequence, pre-European Florida has undergone a population explosion. On the eve of Columbus's voyages, according to a conservative calculation provided by Dr. Henry F. Dobbins, Florida's native inhabitants numbered approximately 925,000. The population levels of 1500 probably were not attained again until 1860, when the U.S. Census found just over 140,000 people, slave and free, living there. Possibly, it was not until the great real estate boom of the 1920s, when the number of people in Florida reached the 1 million mark, that its population surpassed the level attained in 1500. Whatever Florida's original population, all sources concur that by the time the United States took control in 1821, the number had fallen to 0. So far as most Americans were concerned, it was as though they had never existed. For them, Florida's history began with the gallant Spanish conquistador, who in turn was followed by the valorous Confederate aristocrat, and then by the multimillionaire visionary investor. That didn't keep visitors from literally tripping over evidence that Florida had a darker past than the tourist brochures admitted. In 1869, James Fenimore Cooper's niece, Constance Fenimore Woolson, visited St. Augustine. She too makes no mention of any fountain of youth, though she did have some practical advice. During romantic moonlit strolls, she cautioned, one should take care not to trip over the human bones. The future site of the yet-to-be-invented Fountain of Youth was a mass grave.
Yeah. And I just wanted to talk about an anecdote that I had with a conversation I had with someone just last night who is Puerto Rican about Puerto Rican history, because I've been reading up on that too. It's a little different, but also obviously very similar. But because Puerto Rico is like mountainous, and Cuba's got a similar thing too, where it's like the mountains really affect the way in which the indigenous people are able to resist and live and sort of like maintain a level of autonomy even in spite of like total domination. That I think Florida, in lacking any major elevation, that's part of why ultimately was a kind of more thorough Holocaust of indigenous human beings, believe it or not. So let's go on to chapter 4.
Do you think we have time, or should we?
No,
I'll stay till.
How about we just end it on chapter 3? That was a big chapter, so we can just end it on chapter 3.
It was a big chapter. I think we could do 4 and 5 together as one if you want.
Yeah,
or we could.
That's a good idea. Let's
do that. We could aim
to
do that.
I'm happy with what we got.
Cool, me too. I'm happy with this chapter.
Nice.
So, you want to close it out then?
Yeah. Thanks for listening. If you've come this far, dear listeners, thank you so much. This has been Hell on the Beach. We're talking Florida. And I mean, do you have any closing thoughts on this chapter, my dear friend? I think this is a good one because, like I said, the prehistory of Florida is so tantalizing, and so like there's a lot of it that is truly just lost, you know?
Yeah, I think we got to finally close out the prehistoric period here, and then we're going to move on to a little bit of conquistador, and then very soon we're going to be in the early American history period now. And that's where things are really going to start picking up and becoming a different kind of history.
Yeah.
I think what we have been talking about in prehistory is interesting, but we're going to start getting dates and events and names and things like that and narratives.
Yeah, and 1566 is an important date that we dropped in here. Like I said, that's when the first like Spanish Catholic colonial outpost was fully established. But overall, yeah, it's like I think we've really finally established the kind of like morass of Florida that you're looking at in the like mid 16th century after so much attempted conquest by the Spanish and so much like latent indigenous Holocaust happening. The stage is kind of finally set. Like they've been burning so much capital on trying to make this place somewhere that they can like send people to live. And it's finally becoming a place where that's becoming more feasible. But it's always a process of stealing too. And that's what we'll, just to tease the next chapter. That's something we'll
it's
we'll
pirates. We're going to be talking pirates next chapter and this early history of the early pirate period, essentially. It's the early colonial era. And it's almost indistinguishable from just straight up pirates who assume that there's a lot of booty in Florida to be plundered, and they behave as such.
Right. I mean, and the sectional conflicts we talked about, the Protestants versus Catholics that we talked about a little bit too, are going to start coming up a lot more. So we'll get into that in the next chapter. But thank you again for listening. Dear listener, we hope you're enjoying Hell on the Beach. And we'd love to hear your thoughts, corrections. We reserve the right to not mind them, but we would love to, again, hear your thoughts and your, criticisms, critiques, contributions. Whatever you got, please feel free to reach out. And I think that's it. Follow me on Blue Sky, Butler's Ghost. Follow the show, Broken Wind Pod. One day we'll be posting again. We'll get there. We're getting there. We're getting there.
We'll get there. We're working on producing. I think we're through the Tolkien-esque description period that's always tough to get through.
Good point. It is kind of Tolkien-esque, but there's world building you have to do. It's
the world building, the scene setting.
Yeah.
We have to get through that, and the prehistoric period feels that way because, unfortunately, we don't have much interpretation going on until retroactively. So we don't have people charting history conscientiously.
Right.
In that way that Herodotus did when he declared that he was creating the West, quote unquote.
Right.
And prior to that, we don't really have this written record of people conscientiously writing down history. So it's just different to sift through. But I think we're through that, and we're getting to the inevitable period that to us just inevitably gets more interesting because we're used to looking at dates and names and talking about history almost through the lens of the great man theory. It's almost unavoidable.
Well, I was going to say, too, I think it's also a linguistic thing. There's probably a lot of, colonial history that exists purely within, Spanish and Portuguese that we wouldn't really easily get a French to, that we wouldn't easily get access to without learning those languages. And I think that the story of Florida presents us with this story of colonialism and neocolonialism that extends well into the modern world and is also approachable in the Anglosphere in a way that, there aren't, a lot of the other stories just exist in a different climate. Florida's just one of the only tropical places outside of California. And tropical even it strains all those definitions. So we've set the scene. You know it's there's frogs, there's hurricanes. I might have one bearing down on me right now, so forgive me for not posting.
There's gonna be a lot of violence and death.
It's gonna get grim. We're gonna get in some even grimmer stuff, but in spite of it all, it's still a beautiful place. We hope you visit. We hope you've enjoyed listening, and we'll catch you next time. Signing off. Peace.
See ya.
We don't highlight the means, so we settle for them greens. Yeah, highlight the trees when I send it to my knees. I don't sway with the breeze. They can send me to my knees, yeah.